My name is Andrew Milne. I've been a Palo Alto resident for almost 30 years, and I've been following the recent discussions about the city's fire service, particularly the controversy around ensuring there are appropriate resources being deployed to ensure public safety in our city. My family has a very personal connection to this issue, and because of that, I feel an obligation to advocate for change. Put simply, I know there are families who will go to bed tonight not knowing that tomorrow they'll face an emergency that will cause them to call 911. One of those families could be yours. 9 years ago, it was my family. If you live in Palo Alto, you may have read an op-ed piece I wrote in March 2025 relating my personal story and the way in which Palo Alto firefighters and police officers saved my life when I experienced a cardiac arrest in March of 2016. If you haven't seen it, I'd invite you to read it online. In the article, I wrote about challenges the Palo Alto Fire Department is facing after 2 decades of poor decision-making and resource constraints. This was brought on by a flawed organizational structure wherein those people serving in a single municipal staff position, the city manager, have made decisions about resource allocations that in my view have endangered the safety of those who live and work in Palo Alto and Stanford University. In my op-ed, I advocated for 3 major changes to address deficiencies I see. First, Palo Alto needs to change the nature of the governance structure so that a more knowledgeable and engaged group oversees the fire service organization. Second, the city needs to provide a revenue stream for fire service operations that cannot be usurped for other purposes within the City of Palo Alto budget. Finally, the city needs to do a better job of linking operational performance metrics to decision-making to ensure that the fire service is able to perform at a high level in its operations. In the time since my article was published, I've done further research into the state of Palo Alto's fire service organization. What I've learned has intensified my concern. In this presentation, I'll detail some of the facts that suggest major changes are necessary to ensure the safety of city residents and visitors. The data I will share is drawn from a variety of official sources, including budget documents, performance reports, and a 2023 countywide fire service review in Santa Clara County, California. There is more data one could add to what I've collected here, but at this point I believe there's enough I can share to provide sufficient evidence to demonstrate the need for change. So let's look at the evidence and get a sense of how big a problem the city of Palo Alto is facing. It doesn't take a lot of detective work to recognize some of the trends that together will increase the danger to public safety in Palo Alto in the coming years. Increased population of older adults, the fact that we have more hazmat dangers coming from increased use of EVs, including cars, trucks, bikes, scooters, as well as in homes. Population growth and the structure inventory increases. So we're going to have more houses and more people in Palo Alto. We've got a collection of older homes that are going to have overloaded electrical systems that could create fire hazards. And of course, with climate change, we face increased danger of wildfires. A fire service review that assessed the readiness of fire departments and districts across Santa Clara County found that Palo Alto's fire department has faced resource reductions that resulted purely from an effort to cut costs, without regard to the implications or the impact the reductions would have on fire service operations. Cost, not public safety, had been the primary driver in decision-making for a decade, and it continues to be a major factor years later. Recently, many Palo Alto residents have been concerned over a lack of staffing for a fire engine in South Palo Alto. In reality, this is just one example of poor decision-making that was obfuscated from the public. In reality, there are many issues that are the result of poor oversight and misaligned priorities. I will enumerate here some of the more significant signs of the larger problem. One is a failure to meet the priority warden response time target that Palo Alto Fire Department has. This target is 8 minutes, which is a few minutes more than that of neighboring cities. Yet in the face of resource challenges, its average is almost 2 minutes more than its target. An emergency case like a cardiac arrest, every minute reduces the chances of survival by 10%. Adding to this, the city relies on staff overtime to fulfill service hours. In fact, in 2023, if you looked at the operational staffing budget, an additional 13% was spent on overtime. Now this is pretty concerning, not only because of the money spent, but the wear and tear that creates for the staff. We're also seeing that there was a reduction in resources at the same time that there was an increased call for services. So basically, as we're getting more calls for service on the fire department, simultaneously fewer fire staff were actually available during the day. Fire vehicles are significantly beyond their ideal service life. In fact, a neighboring community is already on its second round of replacing vehicles after purchasing its original fleet at the same time as Palo Alto purchased vehicles still in frontline service. With the exception of one station that was built a few years ago, all of Palo Alto's fire stations are rated fair in 2023, with the exception of one, Station 4, which was rated poor. All of these substandard stations are reaching the end of their life, but there is no plan to replace them. And resource limitations in one area, South Palo Alto, are so bad that the neighboring Mountain View Fire Department has deactivated the mutual aid agreement for medical calls in that area, so that its units are not making up for the lack of funding from the city of Palo Alto for southern Palo Alto. And finally, the use of cross-staffing, which several fire professionals at the captain and chief ranks have admitted is a poor practice for frontline apparatus, has been repeatedly deployed at the city manager's prompting to give the impression of adequate staffing coverage. This visual juxtaposes the service demands and performance metrics against resources allocated for the fire service. Calls for service by the fire department, shown in blue, has been increasing for years. There was a slight dip in 2020 due to the fact fewer people were coming to Palo Alto during the pandemic, but the number of calls each year has since picked up and is increasing. Comparing the response times to major calls, shown in red, one can see that the average response time in 2024 was almost double what it was in 2013. Looking at the number of firefighters on duty during the day each year, shown in purple, one sees that the number of staff on duty dropped at the same time that calls for service were increasing. These staff reductions were a result of cost-cutting efforts by the Palo Alto City Manager's office. In the meantime, a number of significant incidents, shown in black along the bottom edge of the figure, help flesh out a narrative of mismanagement and lack of responsiveness on the part of the city leadership, again emerging from directives originating from the city manager's office. I'll share briefly now some quotes taken from public documents. Corresponding with reductions in staffing, Palo Alto Fire is not meeting its target's performance goal, measured in terms of average response time for the first units to arrive. You can see this quoted in the document from the Countywide Fire Service Review in 2023. Similarly, the Palo Alto Fire Chief noted in the County Fire Service Assessment that the recruitment and retention, along with firefighter wellness, are ongoing challenges. In Palo Alto's proposed budget for 2026, it was noted that the department had hired an average of 8 new firefighters each year. This represents a turnover rate significantly greater than would be expected purely from retirements. This is due to undesirable working conditions induced by poor decision-making and resource limitations. The impact of this is that Palo Alto is not able to maintain an operations staff that has well-balanced force of trained professionals. At times during the course of the last 10 years, Palo Alto has implemented a cross-staffing approach for some engines and ambulances, which gives the false impression that the city is staffing more units than it actually is. Cross-staffing was never meant to be implemented in a way that shares staff for 2 frontline units, an engine and an ambulance. It was designed to make specialty equipment, like wildland fire engines, available during infrequent incidents. Due to the nature of ambulance calls, cross-staffing an ambulance with an engine tends to bias availability of the ambulance. That is, an engine is much less likely to be available in its district because an ambulance may be serving calls in a distant location and may be involved in transporting a patient after the call. In the most recent instance of cross-staffing at station number 4, the ambulance at that station is the highest utilized unit in the city, with utilization of 19% that is double the 10% rate that is considered a heavy load. As we saw in the Los Angeles fires in January 2025, the issue of unit availability is often not a matter of being equipment, but rather of having staff to operate that equipment. Looking at Palo Alto's past deployment configurations, we want to consider staffing rather than just vehicles. This diagram shows how Palo Alto significantly changed operational staffing for its fire service over time, with its most drastic reduction manifesting in 2017. What may not be obvious from this diagram is that a fire engine is arguably a more capable first response unit. In addition to responding to fire suppression calls, it carries the same emergency medical gear as an ambulance. The benefit of an engine, being the first unit responding to a medical call, is that it brings a crew of 3 versus an ambulance that provides only 2 first responders. This is an important factor to track is the number of fully staffed versus cross-staffed fire engines available in the city. Note that despite some of the trends I cited at the beginning of this presentation, including the larger number of and ongoing growth in calls for service, Palo Alto Fire Department is still at lower capacity from a staffing perspective than it was 15 years ago. The most recent unit to be addressed was that of Engine 64, serving Fire District 4 in South Palo Alto. While the 2023 countywide assessment called for adding a full-staffed engine to the existing ambulance or medic unit at Station 4, the city's response was to instead implement a cross-staffing approach for these frontline units in spring of 2025. And this was only after residents became aware of the issue and self-organized to advocate for the unit to be staffed. In its first day of operations, the medic unit in Station 4 responded to 11 calls for service, during which Engine 64 was unavailable. On that same day, Engine 64 was only able to respond to 1 call for service. Hence, while it looked as though an engine was now available at Station 4, in reality, for significant portions of the first day, there was a vehicle parked at the station, but no crew to staff it. This is an example of decision-making based on cost considerations rather than operational needs. In this case specifically, the decision went against the professional recommendation in the county review document. The county review document also noted that several Palo Alto fire vehicles were only in fair condition. These units have continued to age and yet are still in use as frontline units. In fact, many of Palo Alto's engines were purchased in 2009 and are still in use. In contrasting, as I mentioned earlier, neighboring Mountain View also purchased vehicles in 2009, replaced them once, and now is getting ready to initiate another round of replacements. Palo Alto fire stations themselves are also in dire straits. The only station assessed to be in better than fair condition is Station 3 on Newell Road, which was rebuilt in 2022. While the one station deemed in poor condition, Station 4 at Mitchell Park, is now due to be replaced, all of Palo Alto's other stations were deemed to be only in fair condition in 2023. Excluding the Wildland Station, number 8, the average age of the stations that will not have been replaced recently is 55 years. The countywide review noted that Palo Alto stations do not meet the requirements for modern firefighting. Moreover, it stated that stations 1, 2, 5, and 8 were nearing their end of life and should be replaced, and that there needed to be a facility replacement plan in place. The fact that the city has no such plan several years after this report again indicates a lack of effective oversight. Resource deficiencies are tied to fiscal decisions, so it is important to examine how the city is prioritizing its funding allocations. In an effort to cut its costs, the City of Palo Alto has cut into the fire department's budget. As noted in the countywide review, fire departments that are funded primarily through general funds struggle as they aim to minimize costs, limit services, and seek out alternative revenue streams to fund fire services. This creates a dangerous dynamic in which decision-making is driven by cost considerations rather than community safety. Due to the fiscal decisions by Palo Alto's government, service levels were not restored to pre-pandemic levels as of 2023, and in fact are still not fully restored in 2025. While the city mayor recently claimed the city was investing $55 million in the fire service, in fact almost $19 million of that number is coming from outside revenue sources. For instance, the contract with Stanford University to provide fire services. As such, in 2025, the city of Palo Alto is in reality investing only $36 million from the general fund. One might wonder how this compares to neighboring cities. Consider Menlo Park, whose fire service is organized as a fire district versus a city department, and which had in 2024 a comparable number of calls for service to Palo Alto. Menlo Park's fire budget is $77.6 million, with invested reserve of $130 million. Los Altos Hills, whose fire service is also organized as a fire district, has a budget of $18.5 million and a reserve of $40 million, which supports a service call quantity that is approximately 10% of that for Menlo Park and Palo Alto. Palo Alto's budget per service call is significantly lower than that of both these examples. All of the previous information points to symptoms of a larger problem than most residents realize. I'll now comment on what I see as causes for this problem. There are three key leader roles involved in the current oversight of Palo Alto Fire Service. City council members are elected for a 4-year term and deal with many city issues at a time. They are not afforded the luxury of time to become intimately familiar with fire service operations and issues. As a result, they rely on guidance from the city manager in making decisions related to the fire service. The city manager typically holds his, in recent years the city manager has been male, position well beyond the tenure of one council member. As such, he is in a position to influence discussion. The role of the city manager is to build a budget spread across multiple departments, and as such does not necessarily prioritize funding for the fire service, even if the council states publicly that public safety is one of its main focus areas. Finally, the city fire chief is an at-will employee hired by the city manager, ostensibly with input from the city council. In reality, the city manager selects a single candidate to present the city council for approval, giving them little leeway to influence the selection. Once hired, the fire chief is beholden to the city manager for his position, and as such is likely to work within the boundaries the city manager lays out, even if the decisions are not optimal in relation to public safety considerations. Essentially, the fire chief is, due to the organizational structure, highly incentivized to do the bidding of the city manager, which is most often linked to cost containment. This diagram depicts the fact that the fire department is just one of several departments under the purview of the city manager. The city manager recommends to the city council, through the budgeting process, how available financial resources should be distributed among these departments. In lean years, one option at the city manager's disposal is to reduce the number of resources dedicated to fire department to bolster or limit impact to other departments. It seems clear that it is time to consider an alternative structure wherein fire services work more independently, with a dedicated board of directors or a fire commission, and an independent stream of funding that can only be used to fund the fire service. Palo Alto is in the unfortunate situation is in this unfortunate situation due to short-term budget-focused planning. The city needs to develop more proactive process that will look to the future and put longer-term plans in place. Summarizing next steps at a high level, these are some of the things that are needed. We need to address the current situation and make corrections to things like equipment and facilities, working conditions, the training and readiness of the fire staff, and funding sources. It's going to be important that we institute better planning processes that are future-focused, and we need to consider how to extend service offerings appropriately to improve safety in the face of the future trends mentioned earlier in the presentation. Overall, these problems have their source in poor governance structure, lack of predictable and protected funding streams, and an inadequate performance tracking. If you would like to, it's time for Palo Alto really to take a closer look at these issues and try to create a better situation. If you would like to reach out to learn how you can help advocate for change on this issue, please send email to the email address below. Thank you for your attention.